My name is Rebecca Cary, and I'm a senior staff attorney at the Humane Society of the United States. For over a decade, I've focused almost exclusively on farm animal protection issues. I also currently serve as the co-chair of the D.C. Bar Animal Law Committee. Now, perhaps you're one of the millions of Americans who enjoys bacon and eggs for brunch. Or maybe you're not. At the outset of this presentation, I just want to make really clear that the purpose of it is not to convince anyone to change their eating habits. Rather, the purpose is to encourage everyone, no matter their diet, to examine the practical and legal consequences of treating animals who will be raised for food just a little bit better. In 2020, nearly 10 billion land animals were slaughtered for American appetites. And the average American eats about 280 eggs a year. And so the scale of production that we're going to be talking about today is simply massive. And it follows then that laws that govern the treatment of these animals have the potential to do a whole lot of good. So we'll be talking today about the critical role that states play in farm animal protection laws and some of the constitutional challenges to those laws. And we're going to focus primarily on California due to the successes that that state has had in beating back challenges to their humane scheme. And also because California has been such an important part of the massive shift for farm animals all over the country, a shift that has positively affected millions of lives. Now, most people don't really think a whole lot about farm animals, and I certainly didn't. Although some of my earliest and fondest memories involve advocating for animals. For example, in elementary school, I started a Save the Animals club, and I wrote some letters to local government officials because I was very concerned that a planned housing development would affect the local deer population. But I didn't encounter a whole lot of farm animals growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so it really wasn't until college, when I started getting involved with some local animal advocacy efforts, that I learned more about what happens behind those closed barn doors. And this awakening would eventually lead me to a lifelong passion for farm animals and to law school, where I focused primarily on animal law, and I participated in a signature gathering campaign for one of the very laws that we're going to be talking about today. But before we get there, I'd like to show you why the kind of farm animal laws we'll be talking about today are so very critical. Consider for a moment an egg-laying hen. In most farms in this country, she's confined in a barren wire cage known as a battery cage. Each cage is about the size of a microwave, and inside, birds are packed together, row after row and column after column, and each bird has no more space than that of an iPad on which to live out their entire lives. She's crammed in so tightly that she cannot even spread or flap her wings. Consider also a mother pig. She's confined in most farms across the country in a metal cage known as a gestation crate for much of her life. This cage is barely larger than her own body, and she's constantly impregnated and re-impregnated in a vicious cycle, gnashing her teeth against the bars of her enclosure, a cage that's so small that she can't even take more than a step forward or backwards, let alone turn around. So, how did we get here? How did we get to a point where our legal system tolerates the kinds of abuses I just described? Well, sadly, part of that answer is that what federal law does when it comes to farm animals is, well, not much at all. Now, federal law does have some minimal protections for some animals during things like slaughter and transport, but federal law has absolutely nothing to say about how that mother pig or that hen is raised on the farm where she spends the entirety of her life. Now, some people say, what about the Animal Welfare Act? Isn't that a federal law that has certain standards for the treatment of animals? But the thing is, farm animals are actually exempted from the Animal Welfare Act altogether. Indeed, they're exempted from the very definition of animal. So why not just change the federal law then? Well, part of that answer has to do with the fact that there are many powerful animal agricultural interests who maintain that their bottom line depends on the kinds of abuses I just described. To be clear, animals are not being raised on Old MacDonald's farm anymore. Since the 1950s, there's been an increased consolidation of the animal agricultural industry into factory-like settings that you may have heard referred to as factory farming. A recent White House report notes that there are actually just 4 large meat processors dominating the market. And these processors have an enormous amount of power over smaller producers and lawmakers alike. Some of these big players include some of the litigants that we're going to be talking about today. So as just a quick intro to some of those acronyms that are going to come up, we'll be talking about NMA, the National Meat Association, which later became NAMI, the North American Meat Institute, and we'll also be discussing NPPC, or the National Pork Producers Council. Some of its members include some of the largest pork producers in the world, like Smithfield and Hormel. So, this combination of a void in federal law and large producers who think that treating animals humanely is just not profitable has created an urgent need for states to step in and act on behalf of farm animals. So if states are going to step in and fill some of this federal void when it comes to farm animal treatment, what exactly are the parameters of what they can and cannot do? Well, perhaps to answer that question, it's actually best to start with a quick cautionary tale of what states cannot do. It's the tale of a California law coming up against one of those few federal laws that I mentioned do govern part of the farm animal production process: slaughter. The Federal Meat Inspection Act, or FMIA, regulates the before-slaughter inspection of animals. It came about after the 1906 release of Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle. That book told in vivid, horrific detail about the unsanitary and inhumane conditions at meatpacking plants, and it led to widespread public outcry. And that outcry eventually led to the passage of what would become the FMIA. Now, sometimes at slaughterhouses, animals collapse, either because of injury or illness or just sheer exhaustion. And when that happens, those animals are known as non-ambulatory or downed animals. And what the FMIA does is it sorts those animals into 2 categories. Animals are either condemned, in which case they are taken out of the food supply altogether, or they are marked as suspect and monitored, and it is later determined after their slaughter whether those carcasses can become part of the food supply. Fast forward to 2007, when the Humane Society of the United States released investigative footage of federal slaughterhouse workers kicking and beating downed cows, trying to force them to walk to their slaughter by using things like high-pressured water hoses and electric prods as these animals screamed in pain. The release of this footage horrified citizens, just as they had been horrified 100 years earlier when Sinclair's novel came out. The footage was played on every major news station across the country, and it would lead eventually to the largest beef recall in American history. Much of that meat had been destined for the National School Lunch Program. Partially in response to this investigative footage, California amended its law to forbid slaughterhouses from buying downed animals or holding on to them without euthanizing them immediately to put them out of their misery. And the National Meat Association, NMA, didn't like this very much. They brought suit against California, saying that the state's law could not stand because federal law, the FMIA, took priority over it. They said that the FMIA had the exclusive purview of slaughterhouse premises and facilities. The Supreme Court agreed with NMA. It said that the California law was essentially forcing slaughterhouses to treat downed animals differently than the federal law does, and that therefore the state law could not stand. So what comes out of this case is that the decision really limits what states can do when it comes to slaughter of animals or anything that could be seen as affecting the premises and facilities of those slaughterhouses. But very importantly, the decision left room for states to act far and away from slaughterhouses. For example, by banning cruel practices like gestation crates and battery cages. We'll refer to these types of laws as farm animal confinement and sales laws. And they're increasingly gaining a lot of momentum. But the first question that any state has to ask next is where exactly to place these laws in their state's code. States basically have three options when it comes to where to place their confinement laws: criminal, administrative, or civil. And there are some inherent limitations to each of these, a few of which I'll just mention briefly. The vast majority of state anti-cruelty laws are housed in states' criminal codes generally. And so you would think that that's where the most natural fit for confinement laws might be. And placing them in a state's criminal code has the advantage of meeting the sense of moral outrage that many animal advocates have long felt over the total lack of farm animal protections. The state codes often exclude farm animals just as the federal law does. And so, as with attempts to change federal law, large animal agricultural interests are likely to be none too keen to have practices that they consider to be essential business practices suddenly criminalized. And so, placing a confinement law in a state's criminal code is likely to face some steep and powerful opposition. Placing a law there is also likely to come up against at least a certain amount of consumer discomfort. For example, a person who is more than willing to send someone to prison for beating Fluffy or Fido might not be quite as comfortable sending someone to prison for beating Wilbur the pig. We just don't tend to treat and think about farm animals the same way as we do companion animals in this country. Indeed, the animal movement itself has frequently traded away protections for farm animals for increased protections for companion animals. Even though farm animals make up 90% of the domesticated animals in this country, most of our criminal laws target behavior related to companion animals. And there are also those who question whether criminalizing maltreatment of farm animals is always desirable in the first place. For example, does doing so adequately address the cause of the maltreatment in the first place? And of course, as with any criminal law, enforcement is often fraught with inequities across different population groups. So another possibility for the placement of state confinement laws would be in a state's administrative code. Many states have boards that are called livestock care standards boards. And these are boards that get their power from the state's Department of Agriculture and are tasked with coming up with treatment standards for farm animals. So you would think that influencing these types of boards, their makeup, and the standards that they're setting might have an enormous amount of possibility for farm animals. And indeed, one of the advantages of this kind of placement is that there's a lot of room for public engagement on the standards. However, these agricultural boards are often made up of the very same agricultural interests that have been routinely opposed to any kind of humane change. And so what livestock care standards boards end up doing is often exempting practices that they consider routine, such as tail docking or castration without anesthesia, from things that the board might otherwise consider to be inhumane. And so because of the complications with placement in the criminal code and the administrative code, many confinement laws are placed in a state's civil code, most often in a standalone civil scheme. And another advantage of placing them there is that they can be enforced by an attorney general instead of, say, a Department of Agriculture, which might be a bit more co-opted by some of those industry interests. Also, placement in a state civil code allows states who have them to take advantage of the ballot initiative process. And we'll turn to that now. 26 states have a ballot initiative or veto referendum process, by which I mean a system where citizens propose, enact, amend, or even repeal laws by collecting enough signatures from citizens and getting them posed directly to voters. California was actually not the first state to use the ballot initiative process to aid farm animals. That was actually Florida back in 2002, when the state banned gestation crates for pigs. But it wasn't until California addressed the confinement of not only pigs, but also veal calves and egg-laying hens that there was any major legal pushback. The story of Proposition 2 is the story of meaningful change for farm animals on a level never before seen. And it started an avalanche of litigation. Picture California in 2008. Advocates there were emboldened by victories in states like Florida, and they knew that citizens were still reeling from that investigative footage at the slaughterhouse in California. And so they decided to seize this moment for animals. So what did Proposition 2 do exactly? This law that would go on to inspire so much legal backlash. Well, what it said was that farms in California needed to provide sufficient space for veal calves, egg-laying hens, and pregnant pigs to be able to stand up, lie down, turn around, and extend their limbs. Not such radical stuff, right? I remember when I was signature gathering for this effort out in California, and my friends and family members and neighbors were horrified to learn that animals across the state didn't already have the ability to engage in such basic movements. And my friends and neighbors were not alone. And that's why a diverse coalition of animal, environmental, and labor advocates came together to pass Proposition 2 by the largest margin of victory in the state's ballot initiative history. Proposition 2 became part of the most robust farm animal scheme in the country, and it helped to inspire other states to act accordingly. But rather than get the message that citizens across this state wanted more humane products in their marketplace and changing their practices to meet these preferences, the animal confinement industry instead has continuously attacked laws like Proposition 2 in court. We're going to talk about several of those challenges today. We'll talk about vagueness, preemption, and the Dormant Commerce Clause, spending some time on each of them because it is where so much of the fight for farm animals is currently playing out. But what's at the root of all of these lawsuits is the various plaintiffs' shared belief that California lacks the authority to pass laws like Proposition 2 in the first place. So let's discuss where states get such authority. California's interest in preventing cruelty has deep roots. Indeed, enacting laws that provide for the public health, safety, and morals are part of what's called a state's inherent police powers. In other words, a state's right to provide for its people. Now, the limits of states' rights can sometimes be a hot-button issue, to say the very least. But the Supreme Court has noted that states have been prohibiting cruelty since the settlement of the early colonies, when there were laws prohibiting cruelty towards creatures kept for man's use. Courts have found that a state interest in cruelty is broader still, and that states have an interest in preventing cruelly produced products from entering their marketplaces, for example, by way of a sales ban. Now, Proposition 2 doesn't have a sales ban, but some of the later laws in California's humane scheme we'll talk about do. Courts in and out of California have upheld states' authority to make sure that their marketplaces reflect their citizens' humane values. And so products from shark fins to horse meat have been banned, and those laws have been upheld solely because of the cruel way that those products were produced. In New York, a law banning the sale of wild birds was upheld because the court said that the state had the right to cleanse its market of unethical commerce. And it's not just an interest in animal cruelty underlying California's confinement laws, but also an interest in protecting public health and safety. And that is indisputably part of a state's police powers. There are at least 2 public health interests served by California's confinement laws. First, cruelly confined animals increase the risk of food safety threats. Foodborne pathogens are facilitated by intensive confinement conditions. For example, salmonella is a greater risk in eggs from hens raised in conventional cages than from eggs from hens who are raised in a cage-free environment. And pigs are well-known vectors of diseases that can be passed along to humans, for example, E. coli and listeria. Second, cruelly confined animals pose an increased risk of zoonotic diseases that can mutate and jump to human hosts and cause pandemics. Recently, a judge upheld a verdict against Smithfield Farms, a large pork producer, noting that close confinement of those animals leads to disease spread in hogs, and that humans are not far behind. And the science on this point is only growing. In the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, the United Nations has said that animal welfare standards are needed in order to reduce zoonotic disease transmission. But opponents continue to minimize, mischaracterize, and ignore states' well-founded interest in both cruelty and public health, contending that laws like Proposition 2 violate the federal Constitution. So let's examine some of those claims. From the moment that Proposition 2 was passed, the egg industry came out in force against it. The first constitutional challenge brought by that industry was a vagueness challenge under the federal Due Process Clause. Now, the legal understanding of vagueness is not actually all that unlike the common understanding. Vague laws offend the Constitution because they are not clear. They might trap innocent people or create the danger of arbitrary or discriminatory enforcement. For example, if a law enforcement officer is unclear on the terms of the law, they might apply it to one person in one way and a different person another way. And so to survive a vagueness challenge, a law must give a person of ordinary intelligence a reasonable opportunity to know what is prohibited. In a case called Kramer v. Brown, an egg farmer by the name of Kramer brought a case saying that he thought that the law, that Proposition 2, was vague. What he wanted was for the law to include mathematical terms like a bird needs a certain amount of square inches of space to be Proposition 2 compliant. He didn't like the behavioral terms of extending a bird's limbs or turning around in a circle, and said that it was just too difficult as an egg farmer for him to be able to understand those terms. And the court thought that this was pretty ridiculous. The court said that it is simple enough to understand Proposition 2 using objective criteria, and that the Due Process Clause does not require the type of granularity that Kramer was seeking. The court said that Prop 2 establishes a clear test, and it invoked a 1970s police detective when it said that you don't need to have the investigative acumen of Columbo in order to determine if an egg farmer is in violation of the law. And so, Proposition 2 was upheld and affirmed. So what came out of this case? Well, as one of the earliest challenges to Proposition 2, it's a really clear example, again, about the role that states have to play in farm animal laws. And it's very clear after this case that mathematical terms are not required for a confinement law to be valid. Vagueness challenges do tend to fail in court, but it's of course nevertheless good practice to be as clear and precise as possible in order to have a clear law. An important thing to note here is that in this Kramer case, as in the remaining cases we're going to be talking about, animal advocates had a very important role to play in Proposition 2's defense. Animal advocates have intervened in cases like Kramer because they wrote the law and are best positioned to be able to tell a court why the law is so necessary to animals and why it is constitutionally permissible. And, of course, these animal groups' members have a vested interest after spending all of this time and money advocating for laws like Proposition 2 to make sure that the laws stay in effect and on the books. Before we get into preemption, I need to tell you what happened 2 years after Proposition 2 was passed. In 2010, the California legislature passed a bill called AB 1437. And what that law did was require that eggs sold in California must come from hens raised in a manner that is consistent with Proposition 2, meaning that whether an egg originated in Kansas or Iowa or anywhere else, if it was going to be sold in California, it must come from hens with those basic abilities to move. Now, multiple litigants have gone on to argue that California's purpose was nefarious here, and that what the state was actually trying to do with this law was to protect in-state egg producers who already had to comply with Proposition 2's confinement standards from out-of-state competition. But the legislative history makes really clear that AB 1437 was actually passed for some of those same health and safety reasons that we mentioned a few moments ago. For example, the increased risk of salmonella from cruelly confined hens. AB 1437 was the first confinement law with a sales component, and so as you might imagine, it caught the eye of some pretty powerful opponents. But it wasn't actually producers who brought the first challenge. Instead, it was 6 states, led by the Attorney General of Missouri. The case was Missouri v. Harris. Preemption challenges are rooted in the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, which basically establishes that federal law takes priority over conflicting state law. Federal law can preempt by the law's very terms, that's express preemption, or by implication, that's implied preemption. Recall NMA saying that California's downed animal law was preempted, and the Supreme Court agreeing with them there. But this is the first preemption test of a confinement law, and the first test of whether a sales component of a confinement law will hold up in court. In this case, the plaintiff states were saying that the state law was preempted by the Egg Products Inspection Act, or EPIA, which they said had the exclusive purview over egg sales. When courts look at preemption challenges, congressional intent is the ultimate touchstone. Courts assume that the historic police powers of a state are not to be superseded unless it's the clear and manifest purpose of Congress to do so. And that's what's known as the presumption against preemption. This presumption is especially strong in traditional areas of state regulation, for example, food production here. And so the Missouri v. Harris court would need to consider the EPIA in light of this presumption. When you examine the EPIA, both the law's text and its legislative history make really clear that the state laws that are preempted are those that involve the inspection of liquid eggs that are broken from their shells, at official plants where those inspections occur. And so it stands to reason that AB 1437, which only regulates shell eggs, not liquid eggs, and does so far and away from official plants where inspections occur, would not be preempted. But the court didn't actually reach this issue. And that's because, for those of you who thought that it was a little bit strange that it was states bringing this case and not industry groups, the court agreed with you. Why? Well, they said that what the states were doing here was just asserting some speculative harm at best by a handful of egg producers who could easily bring a claim on their own behalf. So the case was tossed out of court. Notably, a similar group of states later brought an action directly in the Supreme Court of the United States, and that action was also rejected. So although courts have not considered a confinement law preemption challenge at any length, they have extensively considered the preemption of another California cruelty law. So before we leave the world of preemption altogether, we're going to take a little detour outside of confinement. In a law that first went into effect in 2012, California addressed another cruel practice, that of force-feeding ducks and geese. California's force-feeding law said essentially that a product could not be sold in California or produced if it was the result of force feeding. In order to produce a product called foie gras, which many consider to be a delicacy, it is standard industry practice to force feed massive quantities of food down a bird's throat by way of a metal tube inserted into their esophagus. As the food is forced in, the bird's liver begins to swell until it becomes many times its normal size and becomes diseased. The bird is then killed and their livers are harvested. It's an incredibly painful process for the animals. But as you might imagine, foie gras producers were none too excited about this law. And they brought a case against California saying that the force-feeding law is preempted by a federal law called the Poultry Products Inspection Act, or PPIA. That law looks very structurally similar to the EPIA, which we just discussed. The case is called Association des Éleveurs v. Harris. It's gone more rounds in federal court than any other animal law that I know of. But what the majority of the preemption challenge came down to is the foie gras producers insisting that California's force-feeding law was an ingredient requirement. And they said if it was an ingredient requirement, it was preempted by the Poultry Products Inspection Act, which prohibits states from enacting requirements related to ingredients if they are in addition to or different than federal law. Well, what's the obvious problem here? Well, the force-feeding law doesn't actually impose any ingredients at all. You can't exactly add a dash of cruelty to a recipe. And the courts have agreed. They've said that California is regulating an on-farm process and the sale of products from that process, not an ingredient. And so while part of this litigation is still ongoing over 8 years later, it's yet another example of courts upholding states' authority to regulate products within their own borders based on how animals were treated. And both this case and the Missouri v. Harris case show that there is a limited federal footprint in the arena of on-farm treatment of farm animals, making this area one of the safer areas of state regulation. Of course, it's very important when drafting or contemplating a confinement law or any sort of farm animal law to ensure that such a law does not impermissibly tread into exclusive areas of federal control, such that it is preempted. Before we get to the third and final type of constitutional challenge commonly levied against confinement laws, we need to talk about the third and final part of California's farm animal scheme. We talked about Proposition 2, AB 1437, and next came Proposition 12. For many years, Proposition 2 and 1437 represented the gold standard in farm animal laws. Together, they meant that California required standards for certain pork, eggs, and veal produced in the state, and that eggs sold in the state, wherever they came from, had to come from hens that were raised in accordance with those standards. And during that time, as we've seen, the egg industry and whole armies of states lost challenge after challenge. And that enabled advocates to dream of bigger, bolder, stronger animal protection laws. And so, in November of 2018, a very similar diverse coalition of advocates came together to pass Proposition 12 by a very similar resounding margin of victory. What Proposition 12 does is upgrade the state's confinement scheme. It does that in a number of ways, but we're going to talk about just two of the biggest changes. First, what Proposition 12 did was say that covered animals in the state must have access to certain amounts of enumerated floor space per animal. For example, pigs were required to have 24 square feet of usable space per pig. Recall that these are the exact types of standards that egg farmers like Kramer were clamoring for. And this, of course, was on top of the behavioral standards that were already in place from Proposition 2. The second biggest change from Proposition 12 was that it said that eggs, pork, and veal sold in the state must come from animals with both the ability to engage in these Proposition 2 behaviors, like extending their limbs and lying down, and that they also had access to the same amounts of usable floor space. In other words, when Proposition 12 went into full effect in January of 2022, all covered eggs, pork, and veal in the state have to come from animals with a minimum amount of space in which to lie down, turn around, and extend their limbs. After its passage, a California consumer could go into the grocery store and know that the products that they were buying didn't come from animals cruelly confined. But if you thought that egg producers were mad about Proposition 2, wait until you see the commotion caused by pork producers getting in on the legal action, including some of those pork lobbying groups we mentioned in the beginning, including NAMI and NPPC. So, we've seen the way that courts have shut down vagueness and preemption challenges to California's confinement laws, and now we're going to take a look at what they've done with dormant Commerce Clause challenges. First, a little bit of a housekeeping matter. Where exactly is the Dormant Commerce Clause? The answer, it turns out, is actually a little bit tricky, because if you look for it in the Constitution, you're not going to find it. But what there is a federal Commerce Clause, and that's the provision that says that Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce among the several states. Courts have recognized that this federal power to regulate interstate commerce, or commerce among the states, comes with a limit on states' authority to do so. And that is what's known as the Dormant Commerce Clause. Importantly, courts have recognized that the Dormant Commerce Clause's restrictions are not absolute, and that states maintain authority to regulate matters of legitimate local concern. In essence, the Commerce Clause, what it's really concerned with, is preventing states from unfairly manipulating the interstate market to their own advantage. But the Commerce Clause still protects state sovereignty. And so what all of the various industry challenges to Proposition 12 boil down to is those players' belief that California isn't really regulating matters of legitimate local concern at all with Proposition 12. Or that even if they are, that the law is impacting interstate commerce in impermissible ways. And they insist on this despite the fact that Proposition 12 has a really clear purpose section written into the law. It says that the law is intended to prevent animal cruelty by phasing out extreme methods of confinement that also threaten the health and safety of consumers. There are 3 ways that a law can violate the Dormant Commerce Clause. It can discriminate against interstate commerce. It can regulate extraterritorially, or beyond the state's bounds. Or it can impose a substantial burden on interstate commerce that outweighs any benefits that the state derives from having that law. We're going to talk about the 2 pork industry cases, NAMI v. Becerra and NPPC v. Ross, together because these producers make generally the same Dormant Commerce Clause arguments. And then after that, we'll talk about how the courts have dealt with some of these arguments. The first way that a law can violate the Dormant Commerce Clause is if it discriminates against interstate commerce. In general, states get into discrimination trouble if they favor in-state businesses over businesses in other states. Now, only NAMI brought a discrimination claim, and it couldn't very well argue that the text of Proposition 12 discriminates. And that's because the text of Proposition 12 makes very clear that whether you're a pork producer in Kansas or in Iowa or anywhere else, you need to meet the exact same standards as California producers if you want to sell your pork in the state. And so then what NAMI argues primarily is that Proposition 12 robs them of a competitive advantage that they otherwise would have had. And what's the competitive advantage? Well, before Proposition 12 went into effect, NAMI's out-of-state members could sell their cruelly produced products in the state, while California producers could not even produce them in the first place because Proposition 2's confinement standards prohibited that. And so these out-of-state producers' argument is that they are now at a disadvantage because they cannot sell cruelly produced, less safe pork in California, never mind the fact that they could continue to sell those products in the many markets around the country that allow them, while California producers could not make them in the first place. And what this is really just an argument that producers want to be able to keep using their preferred method of operation, gestation crates. And the Supreme Court has been extremely clear that the Dormant Commerce Clause does not guarantee producers their preferred method of operation. Notably, foie gras producers made a very similar argument in a precedential case that parallels the preemption one we talked about. The foie gras court found that the force-feeding law's impact depended not on where products were produced, but on how they were produced. In other words, if they were produced cruelly or not. And so the court held that the law was not discriminatory. The Ninth Circuit in the NAMI case relied on that foie gras decision in considering NAMI's case. The second way that a state law can violate the Dormant Commerce Clause is if it regulates extraterritorially. Laws are extraterritorial if they directly control wholly out-of-state conduct. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? Well, if California said, for instance, that you cannot purchase a certain animal product in Minnesota or that it has to be a certain price, that would be reaching into Minnesota and directly controlling that conduct there. And so what NAMI and NPPC are saying here is that the inevitable effect of Proposition 12 will be to force the entire pork industry to change the way that it houses pigs, and that the law, therefore, controls out-of-state conduct. But how exactly would Proposition 12 do that? What pork producers are saying is that it is too hard for them to separate products out for California from products that are going other places in the country. And so a producer, they say, would have to convert his entire pork operation to be crate-free and Proposition 12 compliant in order to ensure its suppliers that products meet the California standards. But even assuming for just a second the truth of this argument, what exactly is it that is causing the effect that these producers allege? Why are they saying that it's so hard to separate these products? Well, the answer is really clear from the briefs they've filed in both of these cases. What they're saying is not an argument about the features of Proposition 12 reaching into other states. What they're saying, in essence, is that it's the way that the industry has chosen to set up its businesses that is causing these kinds of difficulties. So what the pork producers are saying is that it's this highly integrated pork market where a single pig is butchered and divided into many pieces, some of which end up in California and some of which might end up elsewhere. Because of this highly integrated market, it's just too difficult to separate out California pork. And in essence, what this is an argument that there are going to be some upstream effects from the way that the pork market chooses to structure itself. What the pork producers are arguing is that their business is simply too big to be regulated. But businesses segregate and separate out their products for different markets all of the time. For instance, many producers have an organic line of products and also a line of products that are not organic to meet their different customers' preferences. And even some of NAMI and NPPC's members and declarants have noted that it is possible and that they are complying with Proposition 12. For example, Hormel notably is working with its supply chain in order to supply Proposition 12 pork, and Tyson has said that it can do multiple programs, including Proposition 12, simultaneously. The third way that a state law can violate the Dormant Commerce Clause is if it imposes a substantial burden on interstate commerce that outweighs the state benefits of having that law. Now, how is it determined whether a law imposes a substantial burden? Is there a dollar amount, for instance? Well, the Supreme Court has not exactly said, but what they have said is that the Dormant Commerce Clause, what it cares about most is the flow of goods across state borders. And the Ninth Circuit, where the NAMI and NPPC cases are playing out, looks at the burden side of the equation first before determining if that burden is outweighed by any benefits. So what exactly is the burden that pork producers are alleging here? What they're saying is that Proposition 12 is going to have a huge and costly impact on their members. They say that members are going to have to convert their facilities to get rid of gestation crates, for instance, and replace them with more humane systems of housing, and that that's going to be very expensive. They say some of their members might have to go out of business altogether rather than comply with Proposition 12. But the Supreme Court has been very clear that what the Commerce Clause protects is the interstate market and the flow of goods, and not individual firms, meaning that even if some of the producers' members went out of business rather than choosing to comply with the California law, other producers who did have an interest in producing more humane products for the California market would just take their place. And so even if the financial impacts on individual pork producers were shown to be true, that simply wouldn't be enough for Commerce Clause purposes. And we know that major players in the pork game, like Hormel and Tyson and Perdue, are all producing Proposition 12 compliant products and saying that they can do so without a significant impact to their bottom line. Now, the pork industry swore up and down during the Prop 12 campaign that this law was going to cause pork shortages throughout the state and perhaps the country. But the law went into effect in January of this year, and there has been no bacon apocalypse in sight. Even if producers were able to show that Proposition 12 has a substantial burden, they would still need to show that it outweighs the local benefits of having that law. And here we know that Proposition 12 is on really solid footing. We've talked about how well-founded California's interest is in both cruelty and in health and safety. Cruelly confined pork products mean an increased food safety risk for California and an increased risk of zoonotic disease. And California certainly has an interest in not becoming the epicenter of the next pandemic. But producers contend that Proposition 12 doesn't fulfill the purposes, that it's simply not good for pigs to be able to turn around and extend their limbs, or that the science just doesn't support California's public health interest. But the Supreme Court has been clear on this too, and has said that the views of plaintiffs, like the pork producers here, cannot be substituted for a state's policy determination. There are compelling animal protection and public health reasons to prohibit the sale of cruelly produced products in the state, and that should outweigh any interest in having those sales continue. So, how have these Dormant Commerce Clause arguments played out in court? Well, as of this recording, the cases are actually both still ongoing. But here's what we know so far. In the NAMI case, those plaintiffs tried to halt Proposition 12 from going into effect by seeking what's called a preliminary injunction. The courts denied their request, and NAMI appealed that decision all the way up to the Supreme Court, which declined to hear the case, meaning that Proposition 12 went into effect as planned. So while the case is not yet over, NAMI's first stab at taking down this law has clearly not gone very well for them. In the NPPC case, the lower courts agreed with California and the animal intervenor groups that the law does not violate the Dormant Commerce Clause. They granted motions to dismiss, and NPPC appealed that decision all the way up to the Supreme Court. In March, we learned that the Supreme Court has decided to hear this case, meaning that the court will be weighing in on the law's constitutionality. Now, it's going to be a while before we know what happens here. The case won't be heard until the fall, which means there likely won't be a decision until at least next spring. So all eyes are on the Supreme Court as briefing gets underway. A decision striking down Proposition 12 could affect far more than farm animal laws. And that's because what NPPC is doing here is seeking a ruling that would allow corporations to evade state laws that focus on harms that originate outside of the regulating state. In other words, they want a ruling where states couldn't block harmful products from coming into their borders. And that's why an adverse decision in this case could implicate far more than farm animal laws. It could implicate laws involving wildlife trafficking, climate change, or even renewable energy. And so this case is really about so much more than pork. It's a test of the viability of the Dormant Commerce Clause and of states' rights to exclude cruel and unsafe products from their borders. Thus far, courts have consistently upheld confinement and sales laws against federal constitutional challenges. We've seen courts say that these laws are not vague, that they are not preempted, and that they do not violate the Dormant Commerce Clause. And these laws are on strong legal footing, premised on interests that states have historically regulated, including animal cruelty and health and safety. All of this goes to show that state and local advocacy is fertile ground for animal advocates to pursue change for farm animals. Laws like California's confinement and sales initiatives are at the forefront of advocates' farm animal efforts because they are one of the most effective ways to fill the federal void when it comes to farm animal laws. Now, the fight is far from over, but as advocates and opponents watch the NAMI and NPPC cases play out, there is reason to be hopeful. Since Proposition 2, AB 1437, and Proposition 12, 8 states ban the sale of products from cruelly confined hens, calves, and/or pigs. In fact, the Massachusetts ballot initiative looks an awful lot like Proposition 12. And 14 states have some type of confinement provisions within their state codes. In addition, corporations are responding to public demand for more humane products. Unilever, for instance, a multinational consumer goods corporation, has said that its entire egg supply will be cage-free by the end of 2025. And the Cheesecake Factory, a company that's about as mainstream as it comes, has recently announced that 75% of its pork will be Proposition 12 compliant by the end of this year. Commitments like these show that regardless of how Proposition 12 turns out in the courts, the arc of progress is clearly bending towards better, if far from perfect, treatment of farm animals. As just one example of that from recent history, the egg industry, who we saw fight Proposition 2 over and over again, is now over 1/3 cage-free. And major players from that industry have submitted amicus briefs in support of Proposition 12. This level of meaningful change reflects the reality that farm animal welfare need not be a polarized issue. Whether you eat meat and eggs regularly, sometimes, or never, whether you're a seasoned advocate or you're considering gathering signatures for an initiative for the first time, or maybe you're just someone who tuned in because you like animals and you want to see how the law is treating them. We can all agree that treating animals with a modicum of kindness is better for them and for us too. I'm Rebecca Cary for Animal Law Fundamentals.